Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, Dr. Happymon Jacob, Dr. Joy Elamon, Ambassador Chitra Narayanan, all other dignitaries. Welcome, good evening, and welcome. It is with great pleasure that we welcome you to this K.R. Narayanan Birth Centenary Lecture Series. First of all, let me pay a tribute to Sri K.R. Narayanan, who earned our love and respect in various ways. Sri Narayanan's journey, which began from humble background to the highest office in India on undisputed and unmatched merit, encapsulate the very idea of India. He had exemplary and accomplished tenure as a journalist, diplomat, professor, vice chancellor, member of the parliament, minister, vice president, and president of India. Throughout his life, he upheld the dignity, liberality, and inclusivity of our nation, as well as social justice and social democracy. Perhaps more importantly, as the President of India, Sri Narayanan stood firmly to preserve and protect the fundamental principles of our Constitution, withstanding enormous pressures. Sri Narayanan, hailed as India's best diplomat by Jawaharlal Nehru, is one of the most passionate and committed defenders of idea of India. It is for his vision, ideas, and actions that Sri Narayanan's legacy is of enduring significance. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon will deliver the first lecture in this series. We are immensely grateful to Ambassador Menon for accepting our invitation. Ambassador Menon was National Security Advisor and Foreign Secretary of India. He served as Ambassador and High Commissioner of India in Israel, Sri Lanka, China, and Pakistan. He was also one of the member of Atomic Energy Commission. Ambassador Menon is chairman of the advisory board of Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and distinguished fellow of Brookings International. He has been Richard Will Fellow at MIT and Fisher Family Fellow at Harvard. Today, Ambassador Menon would speak on India-China relations, which is very dear to Sri K.R. Narayanan. It is great honor to welcome Ambassador Shivshankar Menon to this program. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Happymon Jacob is the chair of the section. Dr. Jacob teaches at the School of International Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University. Dr. Happymon is undoubtedly one of the brightest minds in strategic and foreign policy studies. Welcome, Happymon Jacob. Ambassador Chitra Narayanan, daughter of Sri K.R. Narayanan, is with us. Ambassador Chitra Narayanan will speak a few words to us. Welcome, a warm welcome to Ambassador Chitra Narayanan.
Thank you very much.
Let me welcome Dr. Joy Elamon, Director General of Kerala Institute of Local Administration, Matthew Entrust, Assistant Director, and the technical team of KILA. Institute is organizing this lecture in association with KILA. Many dignitaries are attending this program. Hearty welcome to all. Thank you to Happymon Jacob.
Thank you, Dimpi. I think I will, at this point of time, request Ambassador Chitra Narayanan to say a few words before I take over and request Ambassador Menon to give the lecture. Over to you, Ambassador Narayanan.
Thank you very much. Dr. Happymon Jacob, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, Dr. Divakaran. My sister Amrita, my daughter Chandrika, and I thank the Institute of Parliamentary Affairs, Government of Kerala, for organizing the K.R. Narayanan Birth Centenary Lecture Series. My father was the very first president of India to vote. The media then called him the citizen president. He placed crucial importance on the concept of parliamentary democracy. In his speech at the inauguration of the Kerala Legislature Complex in 1998, he said, "Democracy was inherent in the thought and culture of Kerala." China played a major role in the lives of my father and mother, Usha Narayanan, both professionally and personally. My mother's book, Sweet and Sour, was translated into Chinese and released with great ceremony during their state visit to China in 2000. My father's particular expertise was in India-China relations and Sino-India border issues. In 1965, when he was head of the China division in the Ministry of External Affairs, his counterpart in the Chinese embassy was Chargé d'Affaires Mr. Chen Chaoyuan. It was a difficult time in bilateral relations, and my father was known for his firm attitude and decisions. When India-China relations were normalized in 1976, and my father was appointed ambassador to China, Ambassador Chen Chaoyuan was named as his counterpart in New Delhi. They had a professional friendship which was based on mutual respect. Much later, during the state visit to China in 2000, I met Ambassador Chen Chaoyuan, who had by then retired. As we stood together talking during one of the ceremonies, Ambassador Chen Chaoyuan turned to me and said, "I remember working with your father, so charming, with his sweet smile, but he has a spine of steel." My father would have been so delighted with the choice of the inaugural speaker of this series. He had for Ambassador Shivshankar Menon great respect and affection. My sister and I are honored that Ambassador Shivshankar Menon is delivering this inaugural lecture. Especially, we have great admiration for him and share many warm family memories. Thank you. Namaskaram.
Thank you, Ambassador Narayanan. Thank you so much for sharing those words about your father, President Narayanan. May I now, first of all, congratulate the Institute of Parliamentary Affairs, Government of Kerala, and the Kerala Institute of Local Administration, and Dr. Dimpi Divakaran for organizing this webinar. The timing, may I say, couldn't have been better. This is a memorial lecture, as Dimpi reminded us, to mark the birth centenary of the 10th President of the Republic of India, Kocheril Raman Narayanan, who was India's ambassador to China in the 1970s before he went on to occupy many illustrious positions in his very distinguished career as a diplomat and as a politician. He was also the former Vice Chancellor of the Jawaharlal Nehru University, where I work these days. I'm sure you have heard of JNU, especially these days. I would like to begin my very brief remarks quoting from a secret note, at the time a secret note, that the then director of the China division at the MEA, Mr. K.L. Narayanan, wrote in November 1964. He began the note by saying that the explosion of the first nuclear bomb by China is an event which will alter the political balance in Asia and disturb profoundly the status quo in the world. There are, of course, a number of very weighty arguments against India manufacturing her own bomb, and he goes on to list several potential objections that might come up. And Mr. Narayanan then went on to recommend that India should build nuclear bombs, and I quote very briefly here: "With the atom bomb in our possession, we would be able to play an effective part in the field of disarmament and make the nuclear powers pay heed to our voice. India's peace image can be projected more compellingly in this manner. Once we have the bomb, we could announce our readiness to renounce it and conduct a crusade for the complete elimination of conventional and nuclear armaments from the face of the earth. It is only when we have the bomb that we can renounce it convincingly in the manner of Ashoka and make a dramatic impact on the world in order to reverse the mad career of mankind to universal destruction." Mr. Narayanan's advice was not heeded to at that point of time, but much of this became policy later on. I thought, since the topic of the day is crisis in India-China relations, it is pertinent to recall these words of the former president, in whose honor we are organizing this lecture. Recall also that India didn't have an ambassador in China in 1961 when the border dispute arose between the two sides. But as Ambassador Chitra Narayanan reminded us in 1976, when India did decide to appoint an ambassador to China, it was again Mr. Narayanan who was the chosen one. These words from the former president, Mr. Narayanan, also indicate that there was always a certain amount of tension in Sino-Indian relations, which never went away despite the appointment of the ambassador in 1976 and Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China in 1988. The crisis-prone Sino-Indian relations were at best managed, but not really resolved. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, our speaker today, is one of our finest China hands. He has been India's ambassador to China, our foreign secretary, our national security advisor, and the special representative on border talks with China. In his celebrated book, Ambassador Menon writes, and the book, as you know, is Choices Inside the Making of India's Foreign Policy. An assertive China is unlikely to seek an early settlement of the boundary issue, no matter how reasonable India may be, even though the technical work has all been done. He goes on to write a few years ago in his book, I am convinced that we are in a moment of opportunity for India-China relations as a result of the rapid development of both countries in the last 30 years, or what we have achieved bilaterally in this period, and of the evolution of the international situation. I would go as far as to say that each country could benefit its core interests by working with each other. And yet, unfortunately, here we are. The question is why? I think this is one of the most disturbing questions for contemporary India, troubling all of us, whether inside the government or outside. And I'm sure in his 45-minute lecture, Ambassador Menon, as I said, is one of the finest minds on China. He has some answers for us. So over to you, Ambassador Menon. We will have you speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Happymon, for that very flattering introduction, but also for posing a big question to me. Thank you, Professor Divakaran, for having arranged this and for asking me to speak today. And thank you, Chitra, also for those very warm words at the beginning. This is really an honor and a privilege, and for personal reasons, a pleasure also, because K.R. Narayanan was always somebody whom I looked up to and respected from my childhood onwards. And he actually helped to persuade me to consider the Foreign Service as a career, and was the first ambassador that I served under when he came to China in 1976, resuming ambassadorial relations after a gap of 15 years. When he entered politics, he represented my home, Ottaparam, in the Lok Sabha. And so for me, this is really a lecture in honor of a mentor, a guide, and a remarkable human being, an example in so many respects. I could spend the entire lecture just speaking about the man, his qualities, his achievements, because his was probably one of the sharpest minds that I've ever known. And yet he carried his knowledge, his intelligence lightly, never making other people feel inferior or wanting, and teaching through persuasion and example. His acuity was profound. He made a very deep impression, not just on his professors, including Harold Lasky, but on Nehru, who had little patience for slower minds. And his combination of intelligence, humanity, wisdom made him an ideal diplomat, and therefore saw the boy from Uruvur with no advantages except a brilliant mind rise to be a vice president and then president in difficult times. He was ambassador in two of our most sensitive and important and complex posts in China and the US. And he was vice chancellor of JNU when it was built up to what was arguably India's foremost university for the liberal arts at that time. And throughout his life, which was not easy, given the prejudice, the obstacles that he faced at various stages, he maintained his equanimity and his dignity, and his commitment to equality and justice, ideas that should never go out of fashion and which we need more than ever today in India. So when we speak in his memory, I thought it might be appropriate to speak about our relationship with China, partly because he knew so much about China, had dealt with China in some of the most difficult days of the relationship, but also was the author of a brilliant 17-page analysis of our relationship with China and of the international situation in 1975, which persuaded Mrs. Indira Gandhi and the government to actually begin the process of restoring a working relationship with China, normalizing it by sending an ambassador, and led them to choose him as the first Indian ambassador to China after the War of 1962. And since he taught us as young secretaries in that embassy in Peking, as it was then called, to be objective and clear in our analysis, I thought I would speak about the present crisis, about why I think we have this crisis, the consequences that might flow from it, and then where we might go from there. After that, I'd be very happy to listen to any questions that you might have. Why are we in crisis today in the relationship? The immediate cause, of course, is the change in Chinese behavior on the border. From May onwards, actually from April onwards, they tried to change the line of actual control to occupy territory which had been under Indian occupation throughout, prevented our patrols from patrolling in areas which they had been visiting for years in the past. India, of course, resisted the changes, increased deployments along the LAC to match the Chinese deployments, and occupied some vacant heights south of Pangong Tso on our side of the line. Today, you have a situation where the LAC is militarized, it's unstable, there's lack of trust between the two sides. The various agreements that we had put in place to manage the border and to keep it peaceful, to maintain peace and tranquility, those are all questioned. And frankly, Chinese behavior has actually made them infructuous in practice. And we now have a live border with, according to the reports, anything up to 2 to 3 divisions on each side deployed in very harsh conditions, which are only getting worse as winter sets in. Both sides say publicly that they seek to disengage. Both sides are also claiming victory, which of course can't be true. And both sides are very parsimonious with information about the actual situation on the border today. So much of what we know is really by inference. But the fact is that the troops are there face to face all along the line, and that today neither side seems to be willing to back down or to change, because both sides define, frankly, a solution to the immediate problem differently. For the Chinese, the solution is for India to back off from the changed situation that her actions have already created. For India, it's a restoration of the status quo as it was before the Chinese changed the situation to the situation before April. So it looks like this is going to take some time. The problem, of course, is that unlike previous such face-offs, which have been negotiated, both sides have withdrawn, etc., this time the Chinese are framing it in terms of sovereignty, as a sovereignty dispute, rather than just as the border is disputed and therefore we are in this situation of a confrontation. You see, as long as the border is disputed, that's something that can be solved by give and take. But the moment it becomes a sovereignty dispute, when they say this is Chinese territory, then it becomes much harder to settle, because no sovereign state can easily give up its sovereignty, and certainly not a state like India where you depend on public support. We are a democracy. So it suggests to me, at least, that This time is much more serious. But the border and the boundary have always been more than just a problem to be managed as a military issue on the border. It's always been a litmus test of the state of the relationship and of the country's ability of the two countries' ability to manage the entire relationship. So why have we come to this? For several years now, the Chinese, who had built up the infrastructure on their side of the border, have been trying to persuade us to freeze the present situation. In other words, while we were trying to catch up with the Chinese by building infrastructure on our side, the Chinese, having done their work on their side and having much easier access because they are on a plateau, on the Tibetan plateau, whereas we have to work our way uphill to the boundary and the border areas. So the Chinese, having done their work first, wanted to freeze the situation and have been proposing various agreements which would say no more deployments, no more new infrastructure, etc. We, of course, have resisted that, pointing out that there is an asymmetry, which we are in the process of rectifying, but that we want to maintain peace and tranquility. And the status quo has basically stayed the same all along the border for the last 45 years or so. And we have signed agreements agreeing to maintain that status quo, even though we might have differences on where the line might be. And those have worked, including various standard operating procedures about how to deal with situations where both sides think they are on their own side and they end up in confrontations. This time they have not worked. So one explanation which that people offered immediately after this happened was that the Chinese were trying to prevent the new Indian infrastructure, the road to the north, to DBO, for instance, trying to dominate that. They offered military reasons to explain. Those might be true, but they don't explain why China has chosen to act in contravention of a whole series of agreements, why she's changed the rules of engagement, and why she has done something which brings the entire relationship into crisis and therefore will have much bigger political consequences, all of which could have been anticipated. Nor does it explain why China has done this at this time. Now, for me, therefore, the reason has to be beyond just some local military gain, some yardage of territory. And because it's also part of a broader pattern of Chinese behavior. China this year has been pushing both in the East China Sea, where she has a dispute with Japan over the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, on Taiwan, where she, in fact, has been making threatening noises about reunifying Taiwan militarily, in Hong Kong, where she is now applying the full force of her own law and her security agencies, despite the agreements that she had undertaken when she took Hong Kong back in 1997, in the South China Sea, where she's preventing Vietnamese ships from drilling, and now on the Indian border. And she is much more assertive in her diplomacy, pushing back whenever she feels China is being badmouthed when there is opposition to what China is doing in what she calls, what her own people call, wolf warrior diplomacy. So China has changed. China has changed, and in some ways, China's behavior has changed. And what has changed about China? It seems to me that we have seen, at least in our relationship, a steady shift towards more confrontation and less cooperation in the relationship since about 2012, which is actually when Xi Jinping came to power formally. Now, from our side, I think The government of India tried very hard to keep that relationship on a stable keel. Prime Minister Modi has met President Xi Jinping 18 times. And for many years, I think the Modi government tried to balance the relationship between China and the US and was careful after the Doklam crisis in 2017 on the border, which took 72 days to sort out and to disengage the troops. They were careful not to offend Chinese sensitivities, whether it was on Tibet, the Indian opposition to China's Belt and Road Initiative was much more muted. In fact, India was silent after that. The framing of the Indo-Pacific strategy of maritime cooperation with the US, with Japan, with Australia, with the others, when Prime Minister Modi spoke in 2018, for instance, was inclusive. It said there's place for China also to cooperate in this. But all that obviously has not worked with the Chinese today, given what China has done. And the result, of course, is that if you look at public opinion in India, today less than, I think the last polls in July showed that something less than 23% of the population look at China favorably. So why did we have an extended period of relative peace and calm where we both went about our own business, stayed out of each other's way, and why has this been broken now? Today, the relative balance of power between India and China is not what it was when we came to a successful understanding of how to manage relations in the 80s. At that time, the two economies were almost the same size. India was in fact more integrated into the world economy than China. We were at similar technological levels. China had just begun reforms, as had India. Today, after 40 years of reform, the Chinese economy is almost 5 times bigger than India's. Most global supply and value chains run through China, which is the world's manufacturing superpower. And China is poised to be a technological innovator in high-tech areas critical to the future, such as artificial intelligence and ICT, such as 5G, etc. So in a sense, it's really the shifting balance of power that has probably led China to believe that she now should be treated differently by everybody around her, not just India, but also by other countries around her, which explains a much more assertive. And frankly, the COVID pandemic and the economic crash that caused this year probably, and China's quick recovery, economic recovery, and ability to control COVID in China itself probably gave her a moment of relative opportunity, which she chose to take. And the signs have been mounting since, as I said, 2012. The signs of increasing tension in the relationship, border incidents became more frequent and larger in scale. Depsang in 2013, Chumar in 2014, when Xi Jinping visited Doklam in 2017, and each one proved harder to resolve. China abandoned her public neutrality on India-Pakistan issues and committed to building the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, $62 billion worth of investment, and much of it on Indian territory under Pakistani occupation in Kashmir, creating a Chinese stake in a continued Pakistani hold. China opposed India's NSG membership in 2015, when in 2008, she had gone along with the consensus giving India an India-specific exemption, allowing India to cooperate in the nuclear field with NSG members. And the PLA is now a semi-permanent presence. The PLA Navy is now a semi-permanent presence in the Indian Ocean. China has a military base at Djibouti on that ocean and controls a string of ports in the Indian Ocean region, along the rim from Gwadar to Hambantota, Kyokyu in Myanmar, and so on, which could ultimately one day be used for military purposes. Of course, China has her string of complaints. India was the first and the only invitee to respond negatively to Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative. And as US-China relations deteriorated over the last few years, India's ties with the US strengthened, particularly in defense. The Quad of India, Japan, Australia, the US, which had met in 2007-8, but then discontinued meeting, has been revived. And India has bought into concepts like the free and open Indo-Pacific, which China regards as attempts to constrain her, to contain China, actually, to encircle China. And she has opposed these concepts. And so today we have a situation where both sides today have their grouses, have larger political grouses. But why did the Chinese do this when it was predictable that that one result of this would be actually to strengthen India-US relations? If China-US relations are going bad, surely China should have worked for India's neutrality. It seems to me that China has probably come to the conclusion, after seeing the relationship between the Modi government and the Trump administration, that India-US relations are beyond a point of no return, that today India is no longer neutral or non-aligned. And I have heard Chinese scholars actually saying so. And that if that is the case, if they've come to that conclusion, then what they have done is to try and show the US that, look, India has its own problems, you can't use India as a counterweight to China. To show India's neighbors that don't rely on India if you want to come and deal with us directly. And to show India also that the US is not going to save you on your border with China. Come and deal with us. Now, it is equally possible, and frankly, to my mind, very likely, that both India and China have a history of misreading each other. And this might be another instance. Because Chinese actions have actually brought about exactly what they should be trying to deter or avert. And we'll look at that when we look at the consequences in a little more detail. And that is something that it's very hard to explain unless the Chinese actually overestimated the effect of what they were doing on the border. On the border itself, they seem happy with the new status quo. And therefore, there's a whole lot of things that it's going to take a long time before we can actually, if at all, if we can restore the status quo, short of military means. And India's first priority obviously will have to be a series of self-strengthening steps, if for no other reason than to restore the effective balance on the border, including military reforms, intelligence reforms, and so on, based on lessons learned from the crisis, so that there's an effective balance which prevents further changes or attempts to change it. But there will be a much larger reset in India-China relations, because there's no going back after this to what they were, to the surface calm that prevailed before 2020. Political relations will be more adversarial, antagonistic, and contentious. And it's clear that we can no longer optimize our China policy for both security and prosperity. Because apart from the military response of defensive deployments and filling gaps on our side of the LAC, we have also started a process of seeking to lessen our economic dependence on China. Because China, until 2019, was our largest trading partner abroad. And in the last 6 years has actually been investing considerable amounts in very sensitive sectors, in high tech, in ICT, in fintech, and in our payment systems, for instance. China accounted for something like 12% of our imports in 2019, but the balance was overwhelmingly in China's favor, something like $56 billion in their favor out of a total of roughly $93 billion. It was overtaken by the US in 2019 as India's largest trading partner, mainly because of services. Now that we have started looking at trying to cut dependencies on China, which are considerable. If you look at auto parts, if you look at pharmaceuticals, which depend on the basic ingredients from China, if you look at the power sector, you look at telecom, where much of what we use comes from China, those dependencies will take a long time and it's not so easy at a time when our own economy is suffering post-COVID, after the pandemic and the economic crash. When we're looking for sources of growth, you can't just cut yourself off from the cheapest and the previous sources of supply that you need. In fact, if you look at the figures, even after what happened on the border, after the deaths, the first deaths in 45 years, India's exports to China in the April-July period rose 31%. And China's compared to the previous year. And China's share in our overall export basket has also increased by 4.5 percentage points to almost 10% of our imports are from China. So what this tells us is that we have this very complicated relationship with China. It's not as though it can swing from one extreme to the other, become entirely adversarial. We still do need each other. There will be much more adversarial, but this purely militarized narrative of conflict and hostility that we now see in the public media, both in India and in China, frankly, does not reflect the full reality of what we do. So where do we go from here? And what are the other consequences of this? Theoretically, of course, India-China relations could, we could use the crisis to try and find a new modus vivendi between us, but that doesn't seem to be likely. Or equally, it could be the other extreme. We could descend into conflict as we did in 1959-62, where the public opinion and emotions and fear of each other and actually misreading each other's intentions led us into a war. More likely, I think we'll muddle through, that we will continue to try and manage the situation, both sides, because frankly, with authoritarian strongmen in power in both countries, with troop buildups, with aroused public opinion, the potential for give and take, for diplomacy, for negotiation is much less. And more likely, we will see continued efforts to negotiate side by side with jostling for local advantage along the LAC and a continued buildup of infrastructure and capabilities by both sides. So what we're looking at is antagonistic cooperation, if that is possible, with elements of both competition and cooperation, where competition will probably outweigh cooperation, but where both governments are now trying to lower the rhetoric and the salience of the relationship. The other effect, of course, will be on our relationships in South Asia, which will become much more intense. Over the last few years, China has been much more willing to not just make investments in the region. Under BRI, she's promised very large amounts, 20 billion to Sri Lanka, 10 billion to Nepal, and so on, 62 billion to Pakistan, and is investing in creating infrastructure and in projects in the subcontinent, in Sri Lanka, of course. But she's also shown a willingness to actually involve herself in the internal politics of these countries. This is new. And an India-China competition for influence in the subcontinent will probably be seen and used as an opportunity by most of our neighbors. It also, of course, more contentious India-China relations also complicates our task of dealing with Pakistan, with the hostility of the Pakistan army, with cross-border terrorism. But the biggest beneficiary, I think, of this tension will be India-US relations, will be the US, because China has always been a factor in India-US relations, right from the Eisenhower days. But if you see what's happened in the last few years, you can see that we've entered into the 4 foundational defense agreements, which create the possibility of interoperability of Indian and US military forces, at least at sea, certainly. And these are agreements which have been on the table now for a decade and a half, but which previous governments had refrained from entering into. And security, defense, intelligence ties between the two countries today are much, much closer than they were before. And I would expect that this process will probably continue, irrespective of what happens in the November elections in the US. While I don't think that India-US relations will become a formal alliance, because neither side is willing to extend the commitment to mutual defense, which is the core of any alliance. That I don't think either the US is willing to offer, nor is India willing to enter into such a commitment. But the relationship itself, the congruence, especially on the maritime side, will, I think, lead, and the fact that the US is a very important partner if we are to transform India. I think that in itself will drive the relationship, no matter, as I said, who wins, what happens in the internal politics in the US or in India for that matter. In our broader relationships as well, frankly, a more antagonistic India-China relationship actually makes life much harder. As it is, COVID, the world economic crash have made the future much bleaker. You can see the effects in the Gulf, where slowing world economy has meant low energy prices, low oil prices, and low demand. And it's unlikely that any of this is going to recover very soon, that we're going to see jobs and economic activity going back to previous levels for many years to come. Of course, the reaction to this harder situation that everybody expects, and it's not only India that faces a slowing world economy, which is being fragmented, has been in India, calls for self-reliance, for Atmanirbharta. But equally, China also has turned economic policy into a new stress on the domestic economy. Politburo in May decided on what they call dual circulation policy, which the new plan, which the plenum is meeting right now, that is being approved, which shows an attempt to shift from exports, the external circulation, to domestic circulations to guarantee future growth. But most important, I think that the Asian order itself around us is changing. And a tougher relationship with China will actually accelerate trends. Now, it's a matter of opinion whether China is succeeding or not in trying to create an Asian order which she feels comfortable in, a China-centered Asian order. But India has obviously bet against it by walking out of the regional free trade agreement negotiations, the RCEP, by raising domestic tariffs, customs duties steadily for the last 4 years, by stressing domestic industry and self-reliance, even though we say this is not autarkic. But clearly we are betting that we can actually develop and keep working in a multipolar Asia rather than an Asia led by any one power, whether it's China or the US or anyone else. That's a big bet. And it's today still too early to say whether that's a successful bet or not. Much will depend on the direction and the magnitude of Sino-US contention. because both of them are much more ideological, much more nationalist than they were 10 years ago. And their contention seems to be structural. The US cannot allow the rise of a peer competitor. She pushed back and defeated actually the Soviet Union. She also prevented Japan in the 80s from becoming a peer. And now she is working to prevent China from achieving global superpower status. Uh, but the difference is that they are today mutually economically dependent. They do over $700 billion worth of trade between China and the US. And China-US, unlike with the Soviet Union, they cannot live separate lives. Uh, so we are going to see this very complicated dance where in some areas they will decouple. When it affects the future of their domestic rule, as say the internet, for instance, China will build her own internet. There will be two internets. There are already in the world, in effect. But when it comes to affecting their own prosperity, they have no choice but to work with each other. 82% of China's reserves of foreign exchange are still in US dollars and in treasury, US government treasuries. So China has an interest actually in those staying liquid and in preventing them from crashing. So today we are in an Asia which is between orders. We've made our bet. And frankly, the state of our relationship with China, this crisis of 2020, doesn't give us that many options today to look for in how we approach this situation. What should we do? My mantra, of course, is simple, is issue-based coalitions of the willing for transnational issues. I mean, when it comes to maritime security, you will find a certain group of partners who are willing and capable of working with you. When it comes to counterterrorism, it'll be a different group of partners. When it comes to energy security, you'll have to work with others. And so, but it's going to need a lot of nimble diplomacy and footwork and a very clear head of concentrating on what is really important to us. Before I end, I want to end actually with one piece of reminiscence and a word of caution. You know, when Ambassador Narayanan came to Peking in July 1976, the beginning of July, it was to a China that was clearly unsettled in transition. The Cultural Revolution had continued with Deng Xiaoping having just fallen from power again. Just before he arrived, Mao was physically sinking. Zhou Enlai had passed away just that January. But no one could have predicted the turmoil and the change that was to come in the coming weeks and months. Within less than a month of his arrival, and days after he presented credentials, China was hit by one of the worst earthquakes known in history, the Tangshan earthquake, which killed some more than 450,000 people and had an epicenter just 150 kilometers away from Peking. There were over 100 aftershocks in the next week, over 7 on the Richter scale. And this most intellectual of ambassadors found himself sending the families to safety in India because the Chinese said they couldn't guarantee their safety. And living with 16 of us, Ambassador and Mrs. Narayan, living with 16 of us in tents in the garden of the embassy for several months. And he and Mrs. Narayan took care of us as parents would their children. They never showed any doubt or fear. And they led us through a really tumultuous period. In a month and a half, Mao was dead. The Gang of Four fell. An era had passed. Deng Xiaoping came back to power. And he's decided to reform China root and branch. And right through this, the embassy kept functioning thanks to his leadership and the way the Narayanans took care of us. I mention this because to point out how dangerous forecasting is, especially about China. And that's what I have so recklessly done today. But I also mention this to give you a sense of the human qualities of the man whose birth centenary we celebrate today. Thank you. I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. That was, as always, an absolutely brilliant lecture, and I'm sure many of our questions have been put to rest thanks to this absolutely brilliant lecture. Before I take a few questions, I think one of the things that comes out very clearly from what you said, Ambassador Menon, is that there is no monocausal explanation for what really is happening, and I think attempting to sort of try and offer any monocausal explanation would be really way of reality. You mentioned it could be that Chinese are a little concerned about the Indian infrastructure building on the LAC. You also mentioned that China's behavior has in general changed in the recent past, and not just towards India, but in general, more aggression. There is less cooperation. And very importantly, you also made this very, very important point about relative power differential the material power has so much increased on the Chinese side. So this is perhaps the normal behavior of an emerging superpower, as it were. The behavior which is a result of the shifting balance of power, as it were. And then, of course, you also highlighted the Chinese suspicions about India, be it Quad, the Indo-Pacific, Indo-US relations, as it were. Ambassador, you mentioned what India should do, and that is issue-based coalitions with other powers, as it were. But as we can see, there's a lot of talk in India at this point of time about the need to engage the United States more closely and militarily. So is this path in some way leading us to some sort of, I mean, you did say that a military alliance would require a certain precondition, which is a mutual defense treaty, as it were. But is this taking us in that direction? Do you sort of foresee that happening? Secondly, you mentioned and sort of didn't explain this further, both India and China often misread each other. I was wondering what you mean by that. Thirdly, one of the things that comes up quite clearly is that compared to China, be it in material power, be it in trade with its neighbors, India is clearly way behind China in many ways. The question I think that comes up quite naturally is, does China need India? And if it needs India, to what extent does it need India? One final question, and with that I will of course take a few questions from the audience, and that is, you mentioned there are two internets already, and this is going to be the reality in the days to come. There already seems to be a bloc that is developing around China. You have Russia, of course, and others are joining them. You have countries like Iran, Pakistan, and of course you have the democracies, the coalition of the willing, that, this, and the other. Are we looking at the arrival of a new Cold War? And if so, are we going to be right in the middle of that? You don't have to take any of these questions, but I thought I'd just sort of put them across to you for any brief comments that you have.
Let me try very briefly, since we should give other people a chance.
Absolutely.
Is this driving us towards an alliance? I think EM has said quite clearly, not an alliance, but I think the relationship will increasingly develop the characteristics of an alliance, short of an actual formula. This is not another Asian NATO. This is not going to be, where we are committed to defend them and they are committed to defend us. I don't see the US actually getting involved in a land war in Asia for many years to come after Afghanistan, Iraq. I don't think there's political stomach for it in the US. So I don't think it's driving us to an alliance, no. But I think it's a relationship where the military defense and so on has actually grown tremendously. In fact, I've said elsewhere that I actually think, unfortunately, that some of the good parts of the India-US relationship, after all, we did Green Revolution together, we've done a lot in education, those parts are actually narrowing. The US is cutting down on immigration. Indian STEM students in the US actually are less now. Over the last 4 years, those numbers under the Trump administration have actually shrunk. So I don't think we're heading to alliance, no, but the relationship will change and the balance within it will shift. misreading each other. I'll just give you, well, simple example, I think. 1962, our leadership was convinced the Chinese would not use military force. Mao Zedong told the Politburo when they made the final decision that, we'll fight a war, we'll win, then in 20 years, the Indians will forget all about it and we'll be friends again. That might be Chinese psychology. They might make up with the US within less than 20 years of the end of the Korean War, where they actually fought each other. But in India, the scars of 62 are still not gone, the mental scars. So I don't think we understand how pragmatic the Chinese can be. And the Chinese don't understand what drives us either. And I think that's for me, but you see examples of this over and over again. Chinese expect other people to behave like they do, which is respect the balance of power, primarily. That's not the natural calculus for most Indians. India is way behind. Does China need India? Well, China doesn't need trouble with India. And one reason why she does these things in 62 now is to show you, is to actually, literally what they say is teach you a lesson, put you in your place and say, now sit down quietly. Don't bother me. So in a sense, it's an attempt to neutralize. But I wouldn't go by these overall comprehensive national power. For the border, it's the effective balance of power on the border. If you have the capacity to embarrass him, you don't have to match him man to man. But if you have the capacity to embarrass him, that is sufficient deterrence. Don't forget, his standard is 62. If he does worse than 62, he'll be told, your grandfather did this with so much less. Now, what have you done? So, of course, it's a mental game. And it's important that deterrence be maintained. And deterrence is ultimately a subjective conviction, not just based on how many weapons you have and the equipment you have. Is a bloc developing around China? None of them is comfortable being part of a bloc. I don't think China-US is a new Cold War because, as I said, they're economically interdependent. They're like Siamese twins, actually, in economic terms. They can't separate without doing grave damage to themselves, both of them, both China and the US. But nor does China have willing allies. But the US is doing her best to make sure that Iran and Russia are pushed into Chinese arms. So far, a more clever administration, let's see whether there is one now or in another 4 years, whenever, surely should not work to do that. Because I don't think that today we are going back to a Cold War type of binary situation. If you look at the actual distribution of power in the world, China is surrounded in a crowded geography by several other powers which are rising. Now, the gap between China and the US and the rest of us might be considerable. But the gap between China and the US is also considerable still in very important respects. The US is the only power who has the capability to project military power across the globe today.
Right.
It's the only one. So I don't think we are really in a new Cold War. I think it's going to be a very different kind of competition. And in the longer term, actually, demography, geography, China's economy reverting to mean, actually probably mean that this idea that China's tomorrow's USA or hegemon, global hegemon, that probably is unlikely to happen. But like any forecast, I mean, this is guesswork, complete guesswork. But I don't see it as a Cold War. In fact, I think if we treat it as a Cold War, we will make serious mistakes because then we'll end up choosing sides and so on.
Thank you, Ambassador. There is a question from Ambassador Vishnu Prakash. Please go ahead, sir.
Sir, greetings, and what a brilliant exposition, edge of the street stuff. Just one quick question. You mentioned possible Chinese grouses. Now, looking back, what would you have done differently? And would you agree that given the power differential, China would have behaved like this in any case?
What would I have done differently?
You mentioned, yeah.
there are three things involved. One is I don't want to get into the military issues. That's something you look at after the crisis and we study, like we did after Kargil and so on. But I do think that we didn't call the Chinese out after they came back into Doklam and settled all across that plateau. Secondly, we went from opposing BRI to complete silence. So we are teaching the Chinese the wrong lesson. They're learning that if you push the Indians, if you tell them don't do this, they will then, I actually think that there is a need to not just maintain deterrence, but also to show that you have other interests and capabilities of doing other things. This trying to balance, to please everybody, to devise an Indo-Pacific strategy which has a place for everybody. This, frankly, for me, that's not the way to go. And I think there is a lack of strategic communication between the two of what really matters to each of us. That, for me, is the biggest worry. This is why I say, as it is, we misread each other.
Despite
and on top of it, we're not actually communicating. Then you're really in some risk. And you cannot leave this to the summitry, to the leaders, because that's not the level at which you can actually negotiate. And that's not the way either China works or actually even we. I mean, you pre-negotiate these things. You might leave one or two issues to be settled by the leaders, but basically you must have a clear sense of where you are, how you're going to move forward. But was it inevitable? I still think primarily responsibility is with the Chinese. Their behavior has changed. And I think their behavior, now why it's changed, of course, there's a whole range of explanations: internal stress, overconfidence, hubris. You can go through all these, maybe all of the above, I don't know. But whatever it is, ultimately the answer has to be found in why China changed her behavior. And was it inevitable? Nothing is inevitable. But was COVID inevitable? I don't think so. This situation is unique. And I think there's an element of opportunism here, which was probably unpredictable.
Thank you, sir.
May I take three questions in a bunch, and if Ambassador could sort of engage them, and then we can go on to some of the other questions. The question from Rohan Chowdhury is whether we can still search for cooperative avenues between India and China, or is conflict inevitable between the two sides. Mary Phillip asks whether, unlike the United States of America, India has not been very vocal in blaming China for the pandemic, but we have strongly reacted over the border issue. Does it mean that we want to work more on our national interest than on an international debate about COVID-19? Dawson asks a question about whether the India's growing closeness to the United States is perhaps a reason for the Chinese anger, as it were. So if you could take these three questions, Ambassador Menon.
Well, is cooperation possible? In fact, I think cooperation will go on, but at a much lower level. I don't think you can just cut yourself off from China and ignore your largest neighbor and say it doesn't exist. And in fact, your biggest trading partner in goods still is China. And China is a presence in your neighborhood, in your industries. And in all the markets that you operate in. After all, whether it's energy, which you depend on the rest of the world for, all these things, China is a big player. So there is no way that you can just cut yourself off from China and go away. You will cooperate, but the cooperation as an element in the overall relationship will be much less salient than before because of what has happened. And especially if you are both turning inwards, as we are saying that we will do with self-reliance, then I think it's the balance will shift between cooperation and competition or contention. India was not strong on responsibility for COVID. Frankly, I think the first priority was dealing with the pandemic, dealing with the epidemic, dealing with the consequences. And this business of blaming each other, demanding apologies, that doesn't save people. If you want to learn lessons, you learn lessons later and put in place things to guarantee that the same mistakes don't happen again. But that's a separate issue from calling each other names or calling it the Chinese flu or Chinese pandemic or Chinese virus or whatever. On the border, we've been relatively mild. The government of India has been very, very mild. Oh, it's leaked tremendously, all kinds of stuff to make itself look good and spun a lot of stories, but never attributable. And in fact, you have a situation where ministers won't name China. Your documents have not mentioned China. For me, that is not very sensible politics, frankly. But the problem here is that you're caught in a cleft stick. On the one hand, you say, nothing has happened. I've stopped them. You've declared victory. In which case, what are you negotiating? And if you say you've managed to stop everything and all is well, then there is no crisis. Then there's nothing to blame China for. So there is a line here where, frankly, projection, narrative control, whatever you want to call it, spin, actually gets in the way of clear policy. And policy includes clear communication with your own people, but also with your interlocutor. They should know clearly what you stand for and what you believe, what your red lines are and what you will do and not do and what you will not accept and what you intend to do. So I think that, for me, there is this problem today with the government of India's strategic communication, which has still not been fixed. And it starts from the original sin of attempting to put a favorable gloss on what is actually not a good situation at all. There was a question about the US, whether our closeness to the US is causing this. No, I don't think so, frankly. That is something we've been transforming the relationship with the US for the last 20 years. It started with the Vajpayee government, it went on with the UPA, and it's going on under the present government. None of that has stopped Xi Jinping from meeting with Prime Minister Modi 18 times. Some people say, oh, it's because of what we did in Kashmir, for instance, changing the status of. But Xi Jinping came to Mamallapuram after that and had what he described as a successful summit. So for me, those are not actual real drivers. I would look to what China's own understanding of her situation is and how that has changed. And that has changed in two fundamental respects in the last year and a half. One, they are convinced that no matter what, the US is going to try and contain China's rise and reverse it, and maybe even aim for regime change in China. So this idea that the West, led by the US, is inveterately hostile to China, I think that is something that has changed. Secondly, I do think that having a periphery, having nationalist issues does the regime in China good. It helps them to have live issues, but manageable issues, not issues where they suffer great defeats, but where they can claim victory and rally support around the flag. It's a phenomenon we all know. We see leaders doing this in all these countries. But I wouldn't say that just closeness to the US is the cause for what, because what has China achieved by doing this? If it was because of closeness to the US, she has actually driven us closer to the US. So this is not very sensible policy, and I assume Chinese are rational.
Thank you, Ambassador. There is a question from Nepal, actually, one Mr. Koirala. With increasing Chinese influence in India's neighbors, such as Nepal, to what extent can India cooperate with the US to counter Chinese influence in Nepal? I think there are several questions about the neighborhood, and you did mention about the neighborhood, but I think the general tenor of these questions is basically given the situation with China and China's increasing influence in the region, where does India's neighborhood policy go from here? There are also a couple of questions about how do you view India's strategic autonomy, either the concept of it or the policy of it. What happens to that in the wake of the Sino-Indian standoff? I think we will take these questions and probably take two more after you answer these questions, sir.
But neighborhood, I don't think this is an issue where India needs to get the US involved in the subcontinent or in these relationships. I think there's no question that India has to step up her own game in the neighborhood in three respects. One is, I mean, India has an economy and the links with these neighbors, which means that we can be a source of prosperity. We can be an economic driver of growth in the neighborhood. Secondly, I think we need to also be seen as a source of security and stability rather than instability and so on. And that can only be done by working with your neighbors. Every one of these borders has cross-border ethnicities, has a whole series of and frankly has been criminalized because we have actually made normal human activity illegal. We've turned trade into smuggling. We have turned normal movement and exchanges of people, of goods, of ideas. We've tried to build fences and close these off. We need to build connectivity within the subcontinent, among these countries, and make sure that India is seen as a source, as I said, of prosperity and of stability, of security. And this will take work. This will take and this is not by imposing reciprocity or by having a narrow-minded view or a transactional view of these relationships. And it's important for India itself. It's important for India to have a peaceful periphery within which we can grow, within which we can then be secure ourselves. So for me, the key is for India to step up its game in the immediate neighborhood. And by this, I mean not just the subcontinent, but actually in the Indian Ocean rim as a whole, because that's the broader area within which we should be doing this. So for me, it's not so much, will India cooperate with the US in Nepal? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, we'll cooperate with anyone who actually helps us to do what I was outlining. About strategic autonomy, we get too hung up with words. What does strategic autonomy mean? It means that I will make my decisions myself. When do I lose strategic autonomy? If I enter into an alliance which says, when any member of this alliance is attacked, we will all respond. Then I've lost the decision-making moment. I've already handed over that decision to the alliance or the leader of the alliance or whatever those structures are. So for me, the core of strategic autonomy is that independence of decision-making. As long as you keep that going, what you choose to do, of course, you balance, you tilt, you lean to one side. In 1971, when you saw something happening between China and the US and you had a problem, you had a Pakistan crisis. And what did you do? You signed an agreement, a treaty with the Soviet Union. But that was part of bolstering your sovereign, autonomous decision-making capacity. So, and it's important to keep that because nobody shares your interests 100%. Show me another country like India with your interests. If there was, I would say, fine. If you had identical interests, then you could say, yes, we don't want autonomy. The two of us will function together, or the 3 or 5 or whatever, how many you can find. But there isn't. There is no other country in the world with your set of interests, with your set of capabilities, with your geography, your history, etc. So therefore, I say strategic autonomy for me is still valid. But I think it's, we tend to convert these arguments about non-alignment, strategic autonomy, genuine non-alignment, into how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, which It's I think we should actually look at reality and see what do we need to do to deal with the new reality that we face, because that reality is changing all the time around us. And as long as we take those decisions, and as long as it's our own decisions in our interest, that's fine by me.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. We will take two more questions and we have to end in a few minutes' time. So the first question is from Kiran Thomas, who is asking, China makes its opinion public even in our internal matters like cancellation of Article 370 on the issue of on Arunachal Pradesh, etc. But India is reluctant to raise its voice regarding issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Uyghurs, etc. Why is that? Why are we probably not weaponizing these issues, as it were? And secondly, Pramod Dev asks, is the Indian government's propensity to control information on the reality of the border issues with China limiting India's ability to call out Chinese aggression and creating an effective response? I think we don't have time to take any more questions. So those are the last two questions, Ambassador Menon.
But very quick answers. Don't ask me why we're reluctant to say things about China. I mean, please ask those who should be saying these things. I can only, as I said earlier, I think I can see the contradictory impulse to say that there's nothing wrong, everything's under control, all is well, and at the same time to have to deal with a reality which is very different. Hence the reluctance to actually call a spade a spade. Does GOI's attempt to control the narrative limit effective responses? Simple answer, yes. Because it's not narrative that is at stake here. And when narrative does not match reality, objective reality, always ultimately reality will win. I mean, if there's one lesson in history, as we used to have a foreign secretary called Venkateshwaran who used to keep saying that, there's a basic law of optics. Image can never be better than reality. And he was right. You can manage, fool some of the people some of the time, etc., etc. For me, it actually does limit effective responses if you are not up to a point. I mean, it's not that you have to reveal everything, but up to a point, you need to at least make sure that your narrative matches what's happening on the ground. And it shouldn't be so out of whack that you therefore don't do things which you should be doing in the national interest. And there is a real risk when narrative becomes much more important. I think ultimately they're right, Satyameva Jayate. And I think we have to go back to that.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. I think we have reached the end of this excellent exposition by Ambassador Menon. I think we couldn't have asked for a better speaker for the day, for a topic that has been bothering all of us for the last several months. And as I said earlier on, I think one of the things that comes out very clearly is that there is no monocausal explanation for what is happening. And I think that it is important to take that home. Simple explanations sometimes lead us to, measures that are perhaps undesirable and may actually backfire. And I think in some ways, what Ambassador Menon is saying is that the things have changed. The recent standoff between India and China has changed things in many fundamental ways for India, as it were. On the one hand, you're looking at this standoff pushing India more towards the United States of America, as he said. We are not looking at an alliance in the classical sense of the term, but there is going to be some sort of an alliance, and that's probably going to be quickening as we speak. The Chinese hegemony is not something, and many people sort of tend to say that China is going to be a superpower now, 10 years, 5 years. Ambassador Menon seems to think that that is going to take a very long time. Hegemony is not going to be a reality anytime soon. But the good news, I think, is again, as someone as experienced as Ambassador Menon is, you know, saying it very clearly that conflict is not something that is going to be happening on a daily basis between India and Pakistan. There will be some sort of a you know, modus vivendi that the two sides will work out in the sort of years ahead. But I think I will sort of end this with this one statement, and I think what Ambassador Menon said is very important in democracies such as this. He's been the foreign secretary, he's been the national security advisor. Strategic communication is very important, and reporting of what is happening on the line of actual control, taking the public into confidence, taking the community into confidence. All of this is very important in a democracy. Only then proper solutions can be sort of devised in order to you know, address the challenges that the country faces. With this, I will call upon Dr. Joy Elamon, Director General of KILA, to say the proposed vote of thanks.
Good evening, friends. First of all, let me thank all of you for being with us today evening, especially as Dr. Happymon Jacob just mentioned, we could not have asked for a better person than Ambassador Shivshankar Menon to talk on the crisis in India-China relations as part of the Chitra Narayanan Birth Century lecture series today. And we had a very insightful lecture, especially for people like us looking on only to our own local media, both in the print and the visual, where we actually do not get to know about things happening across the borders. And so this was a very insightful lecture, as all of you would have agreed. And thank you, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, for this lecture, as well as for being with us today evening. Thank you, sir. And the chairperson for the day was Dr. Happymon Jacob. He again has been regularly writing. We have been reading it, especially in the Hindu daily. Even yesterday, I think, yeah, you had written on this same, almost a similar topic even yesterday. So, and today you have been the chair, and probably next time we would like to hear more from you also about this topic. Anyway, thank you, Dr. Happymon Jacob, for being with us today. On behalf of the Institute of Parliamentary Affairs and KILA, we extend our great thanks to both of you today. We have with us Madam Chitra Narayanan with us. So great of you to be part of us today. Thank you, madam. Thank you, madam. And from the KILA side, I have to thank Dr. Dimpi, who has been the brain behind this entire Dr. Chitra Narayanan Birth Centenary Lecture Series. And KILA has been very happy to be part of this, to associate with the Institute of Parliamentary Affairs. Thank you, Dr. Dimpi and the Institute of Parliamentary Affairs. And I have with me our team, especially led by Mr. Matthew Andrews, who has been working closely with the Institute of Parliamentary Affairs to make this happen, this Birth Centenary Lecture Series. And also our IT team, both the sites and the faculty team, everyone. And let me thank all of you today. And of course, we had a wonderful participants list actually. See, I have been going through the chat box where you find that such a long list and a great list of people talking about, asking questions, explaining and other things. It was again, we are very happy to have all of you with us. Thank you very much. Once again, thanking each and every one of you, as well as the Institute of Parliamentary Affairs from the KILA side for this wonderful lecture and the lecture series as such. Thank you.